Thanks for coming, everybody. This is to be a lecture / discussion on celestial magic, as you can see, and it's supposed to be an introduction to Agrippan occultism. What I'd like to present today is, kind of before we get into the nuts and bolts of Agrippan occultism, I want to talk about the why. Depending on how much time we have after the why, I can go for as long as you want on the nuts and bolts of it. But I feel like the most important thing to present is really the why, because once you understand, like, basically why Agrippa approached things as he did, you can approach the 3 books yourself and start to discover things for yourself. But without knowing why he did what he did, that it makes it a lot more difficult to understand Agrippa. And that goes just as much, that goes for occultists from 1530 on. There have been plenty of people who have taken elements of Agrippa, but haven't taken kind of all of what he did, or taken a holistic view of what he did. And so hopefully at the end of this, you'll be able to see better how to take holistically from Agrippa and how to build your magic up from the 3 books. So I kind of assume that I have an audience that's interested in magic, but not necessarily an audience that's well versed in classical and medieval philosophy. So this is the stuff of which doctoral programs are made. And I'm going to be taking a very wide view of it all. And if anybody has questions, or if anybody needs me to go into more detail, I can attempt to do so. Okay, so basically this lecture is divided into 3 parts. We're going to have, part 1 is going to be some antecedents to Agrippa, kind of what was happening before Agrippa came on the scene. Part 2 is going to discuss a very particular topic of classical philosophy, and that topic is, I needed it as glue so that I could bring you into the Agrippan mindset. And then part 3 will introduce what Agrippa was thinking. So some antecedents. So I want to just begin by talking about the sort of worldview that is useful to approaching Agrippa, both as Agrippa himself and then the historical stuff that I touch on as well. So the worldview works something like this: all of us live in the world, right? Events occur in the world. Some of those events we enjoy, some of those we abhor. At some point, one might decide to say to themselves, well, how do we experience more of a particular kind of event? And how do we avoid these terrifying or tragic events that happen in the world? And so, step 1 to answering that question is, well, what is the nature of those? What is the nature of the events that you're seeing happening all around you? So, to start to answer that question, we're going to take a brief look at the Greek view of the world, the classical Greek view of the world. Basically, you have 2 areas, generally speaking. You have a land and you have a sky. You live on the land, or what we're going to call the land. Land means anywhere accessible to normal people. The earth, the sea, that's the land. Anything that could be termed as being under a horizon is land. And then if you, on a clear night, if you look up and you see the starry sky and it goes from horizon to horizon, that's the other part of it. That is the dome over the land called the sky. And these 2 areas have some seemingly different properties. Namely, that everything in the land is subject to continual transformation, and everything in the sky does not seem to be subject to the same sort of transformation, at least not to the Greeks. So in the land, all life is made of substance, right? And Aristotle talked about how, the one thing that you can expect in this land is increase and diminution of substance. That you have a rebirth of all substance in the natural world, and that this stuff is constantly happening, right? So this is a common theme of a lot of occult science that comes from the late antique Greek world, right? So stuff like astrology, some palmistry, even physiognomy. It all comes from this idea that you have increase and diminution in your life. You are born, and then you have various events that happen to you. You grow, then you mature, you grow old, you lose things, you lose your memory, you lose your body, and then after a while, you perish, you die. When you die, after that, you decompose, you fall apart, and then you join back to the earth, right? This is a near universal of Western religion anyway. It's this idea that you go from dust to dust. Aristotle talked about how this increase and diminution happens through two things. It happens through heat and it happens through moisture. Another way to say that, by the way, is that fermentation is at the root of all change. Cynical way to say it is that all things rot. But the important thing to take from this is that things are continually changing, and they're changing through heat, and they're changing through moisture. And following another Greek philosopher that was an antecedent of Aristotle, Empedocles, he combines heat and moisture in four ways, right? He says that there's hot, dry, hot, wet, cold, dry, and cold, wet. So you have hot, dry, a lot of heat and little moisture, hot, wet, a lot of heat and a lot of moisture, cold, dry, a little heat and a little moisture, cold, wet, a little heat and a lot of moisture, right? And then the last thing I want to go on about Aristotle is that he describes these combinations as elements, right? So he takes this heat and this moisture and he puts it together into these elements, right? Fire is hot and dry, water is cold and wet, air is hot and wet, earth is cold and dry. But his point is, and the point I'm trying to make here, is that in the land, you have continual change. This change can be described with elements, and we're continually transforming here. We're just always changing. And then there's the sky. Aristotle said in De Cielo, on the sky, he says, the celestial body is eternal. So unlike here, the celestial body is eternal. It is not subject to increase or diminution. You don't have elemental transformations happening in the sky. Instead, you have cycles. He says it's eternal, it's not subject to increase or diminution, implying that the celestial body is something else beyond the elements. And he gave the highest place a name of its own, the ether. Aristotle, he points out an etymology of ether, and he says it's derived from the fact that it runs always. So to Aristotle, ether meant runs always. There's a cyclical nature to ether, but it never goes away. And then he points out, but then almost immediately, if you read On the Sky, he talks about how Anaxagoras takes ether as equivalent to fire. So Aristotle first presents a view of the sky, and he presents this root element of ether in the sky. But then after that, he says, he argues with someone immediately. And he says, Anaxagoras takes ether as equivalent to fire. And then he says something like, he calls Anaxagoras scandalous because he's saying that the sky is fire. Where in Aristotle's view, fire was part of the land. Fire was part of the continual transformational process. So we have Anaxagoras and Aristotle arguing with each other. But then, by the way, we also have a further argument. We have Heraclitus. Heraclitus comes along, and ever the rebel, Heraclitus says, the world was ever, is now, and ever shall be, an ever-living fire. So you have all this, we have different philosophers that are saying different things. The celestial world involves constant movement, but not death and rebirth. This is what Aristotle's saying. But then Heraclitus, on the other hand, says the whole world is fire. Just sky, land, everything, all of it, fire. So is it possible to reconcile these seemingly different opinions? I'm going to say yes. So this is when I want to introduce the Emerald Tablet to you. The Emerald Tablet is a work of enigmatic prose. Its first appearance in history is in the 800s. It's in the 9th century. And it is a summary or an epilogue of another book, a book called Secrets of Nature. Secrets of Nature was written by Apollonius of Tyana. And the first version that is available to us is the Arabic version. So when this version first comes along, the Arabic version claims that it comes from a lost Greek work. So as you can see, like already this thing is kind of an historical jewel because it was translated from Greek. It's supposedly coming from the legendary Apollonius of Tyana. So that's the Arabic version. The Arabic version like shows up in the Arabic world. It immediately has an impact in the Arabic world, but it's not until the 12th century. It's not until the 1100s that it makes its first appearance in the Western world. There's a Latin translation of this book, Secrets of Nature, and it's done by a guy named Hugo de Santillana. He was a Spanish translator who translated it from Arabic. So when I say that, you would probably assume that he was translating the version of the Book of the Secrets of Nature. But it turns out he wasn't. His version comes from a different recension of the Secrets of Nature than the known 9th century version. The 9th century version focuses vaguely on alchemy. And just as an aside, that 9th century version, more or less, is the version that almost everybody who's interested in such things is familiar with. The reason for that being that, like I said, when I said before that the Arabic version came into the Arabic world and made a splash, it was added to another book. It was added to a book called The Secret of Secrets. And The Secret of Secrets was later, became very popular. Became popular in the Arabic world. And then later on, when it was translated to Latin, it spread like crazy into the medieval Latin world. So its ideas and the alchemy in The Secret of Secrets built up alchemy. But then the magical side of it, the Emerald Tablet didn't have as much of an impact. Unlike the 9th century version that focuses vaguely on alchemy, Hugo's version focuses clearly on magic. Hugo's version is exceedingly rare. We have exactly one manuscript of it in the world. As far as we know, in both Arabic or Latin, the only version that's known is the Latin version. There's exactly one manuscript in Paris that gives us any knowledge that Hugo's version exists in the first place. The 9th century, I already said that. The 9th century version spread to become what most people know as the Emerald Tablet. Okay, so now we're ready to look at Hugo's version of the tablet. All right. This looks very much like the other version, but there's some key differences that I'm sure that you're going to recognize almost right away if you're familiar with the Emerald Tablet already. So this is my translation from Latin. The superior from the inferior from the superior. Miraculous activity from the one, as all exists, as all leads from one and the same origin and one and the same plan of administration, whose father is the sun, the mother indeed the moon. The wind lifts it up in its body, the land is made sweeter. You, therefore, sons of magicians, artisans of wonders, whose discernment is perfect, if the land is made more spacious from the subtle fire, which surpasses all that is thick and dull, then carry out the work wisely and deliberately. It climbs from the land to the sky. From the sky to the land it falls away, containing the force and power of the superior and the inferior. Thus all obscurity is illuminated by it, whose power transcends all that is subtle and enters entirely into all thick things. This operation is like the composition of the greater world and continues to maintain it. This is what Hermes the philosopher calls triple wisdom or triple science. As you probably guessed, let's analyze. Okay, let's go back to Hugo's tablet. So I'm going to go line by line here. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt. And with that, let's analyze. So line one, the superior from the inferior from the superior. It distinguishes the same dichotomy of upper and lower, right? Sky and land that I seem to be so excited about. That's implicit in Greek, Roman, and Christian mythology. So you go to Aristotle, you go to Cicero, you go to the Book of Genesis. You can find this dichotomy anywhere you look. This idea of the superior from the inferior from the superior, it expands on that idea from Heraclitus we saw before, of everything is an ever-living fire. But it resolves the contradiction between Aristotle and he. The world is an ever-living fire, then moreover circulates. The ether above and the cycle of generation and corruption below are aspects of the same fire. But that idea that they're aspects of the same fire and they're interchangeable, that's somewhat blasphemous to a lot of schools of thought. Because what it's saying is that the ether comes from corruption. The ether comes from rotting. The rotting comes from the ether. That these two seemingly these two events that seemingly have nothing to do with each other and indeed seem to be radically opposed to one another, they come from one another. They're born from each other. And now my notes have frozen. There we go. Okay. Line 2. Miraculous activity comes from the one, as all leads from one and the same origin. So the way that I take this, now, I mean, it's enigmatic prose. So it's enigmatic. You can take it any way you want. What I'm trying to do is take you in a direction that leads towards Agrippan magic. As opposed to the natural activity in line 1, the superior and the inferior. So that superior and inferior, they're locked in a cycle. As opposed to that, that's all natural activity, right? Miraculous activity comes along as an interloper. It comes along as activity from the one. It comes not from the cycle, but from the origin of the cycle itself. So we're drawing a third concept here, a third element. It says it comes through one and the same plan of administration, which is a strange turn of phrase. I tried a couple different translations from Latin. That's the best that I could do. And it seems strange at first, but I think that the next line actually explains this plan of administration somewhat darkly, cryptically. Whose father is the Son? Okay, so sense one for that idea of the Father being the Son, the Son is the father of the administration plan. So that plan of administration from line 2, it's saying the father of that administration is the Son. But also, the Son is the father of the natural manifestation of the subtle fire. So I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit because this subtle fire concept isn't really something that I've discussed so far. Suffice to say for this line that the subtle fire it's the author of change. To explain this a little bit better, I've taken from another work of prose, this one from the 300 to 400s, called the Hymn to King Helios. The Hymn to King Helios says, "The divine and holy, beautiful universe, from the highest vault of heaven to the lowest limit of the earth, is held together by the continuous providence of the God, has existed from eternity ungenerated." So you can see this sky symbolism we were talking about before, is imperishable for all time to come, much like what Aristotle said about the sky, and is guarded immediately by, and this is the important part, nothing else than the ether, whose culmination is the beams of the sun. So what the Hymn to King Helios is explaining is how the sun is the father, how the sun is the father of existence. And in fact, in the Hymn to King Helios, Zeus and Helios are seen as sort of cognates of one another. They're seen as very intimately related to one another. The next part says, "The mother, indeed the moon," right? We're going to go back to the Hymn to King Helios for a second. It says, "By Athene's aid, Selene, the moon, beholds the intelligible, which is higher than the heavens, and adorns with its forms the realm of matter that lies below her." I'm going to explain, in part 2, I'll explain intelligibility, and we're going to come back to this concept that the moon is the mother of existence, that through the moon is birthed the events that you see around you. Important for our discussion of this line, it says Helios and Selene, who share the empire over the visible world. So the Hymn to King Helios and Hugo's version of the tablet, and indeed the general Emerald tablet, follows the same philosophy. The Hymn to King Helios can illuminate the Emerald tablet, and vice versa. And then after that, we start to get into a more natural theme. So it says, "The wind carries it in her body. The land is made sweeter." So notice that there's a parallelism here, right? We have whose father is the sun, whose mother is the moon. The wind lifts it up in its body. The land is made sweeter. Sun, moon, wind, land. And it's it almost seems like an analogy of dew, right? Moisture descends from the atmosphere and it waters the land. The important conclusion from this line the important conclusion that I want you to take from this line is that nourishment of the world is a result of a single universal movement, right? That it starts with the one. It starts with the one origin. And then the one origin's plan of administration is administered through the sun. The events that you see around you are birthed through the moon. If you think in like a top-down sort of way, this line makes a lot of sense. The sun administers, the moon births, the wind, the atmosphere, the air directly below the dome of the sky, it lifts it up in its body. The wind or the air is the medium through which these events occur. And at the end of it all, the land is made sweeter. The land is nourished by this action. And by the way, this is very different from the 9th century Arabic version. The 9th century version says, instead of the land is made sweeter, it says the earth nourishes it. In the 12th century version, the earth/land has gone from nourisher to that which is nourished. So Hugo's version presents a more systematic and more, in my opinion, understandable view of how events happen. Okay. This next line is where all the weird new stuff is. So I want to pause for a second and just see if anybody has any comments or questions or anything. Okay. Let's move on to wild new stuff then. Line 4 is the crux of the poem. Unlike the 9th century vague reference to alchemy, Santaya's version explicitly refers to magic. And we explicitly meet the subject of the poem for the first time, the subtle fire. So part 1, you therefore, sons of magicians, artisans of wonders. This is the first reference that we have in this work to the intended audience of the Emerald Tablet. Because he refers to them directly. He points them out and he says, you therefore. And this audience, they are magicians, moreover, in a hereditary line of magicians, right? They're not just magicians, they are sons of magicians. They are the children of magicians. This has been happening for generations for these people that he's talking to. Just as a side note, the original Latin for the term sons of magicians is prestigiorum filii. The sons of prestigiorum. Prestigia meaning jugglers or stage magicians. It's a lot less the holy priests and a lot more the circus sideshow. So even when this was written in at least the 1100s, we have this weird dichotomy that exists still today of circus entertainment and actual wonder workers. And then he calls them artisans of wonders, right? This term of artisan, it refers to craft, and it refers to artistic craft. He's referring to people that are they're making things, they're sculpting things, and that is the form of magic that they're using. After that, he says, whose discernment is perfect. So at this point, we have some clues as to the identity of these magicians, right? First off, they were in a hereditary line. And secondly, discernment was apparently a dominant trait of theirs. Now, it's enigmatic prose. We don't know for sure who he was talking to, but we have a pretty good guess. This book, The Secrets of Nature, came from the culture of the Sabians of Haran. And Haranian Sabians taught magic. They were hereditary magicians. They taught this very Hellenic philosophy. They were just as much into Empedocles and Heraclitus as anybody. Discernment to the Sabians was their main tool. We know this because we know who their most distinguished citizen was, Thabit ibn Qurra. He wrote in the medieval period. His work De Imaginibus was very important and was promulgated throughout Latin Europe. And if you ever actually read Thabit's writing, he has incredibly discerning talismans in there. Stuff that I've never made anything from Thabit's work, just because of the sheer complexity of it. It's just incredibly rare to find the stuff that he's talking about. But if you're looking for discernment, look no further than Thabit's writing. I'm taking discernment to mean to refer to discernment of timing. So, because as you'll see, celestial magic is highly concerned with astrological timing. Timing is everything when it comes to celestial magic. If you have timing and you have nothing else, you have celestial magic. If you don't have timing and you have beautiful materials, you're not going to be able to do anything. So my best guess, this is my personal opinion, but my best guess is that Hermes is directly addressing celestial magicians in the tradition of the Huronian sapiens. Okay, so now we talked about that. If the land is made more spacious from the subtle fire. So we're talking about land again, and that land is a reference back to line 3. Right, so the land is made sweeter. He just said that the land is nourished, the land is made sweeter. What I'm taking in the next line, he says, if the land is made more spacious. What I'm taking from this is that the idea of the land becoming sweeter and the land becoming more spacious, they're closely related. They're closely related to one another. The spaciousness of the land being a way that the land can be sweet. Anybody who's involved in real estate can tell you that. And then the other thing that happens is he says, if the land is made more spacious from the subtle fire. The subtle fire, what the subtle fire tells us is that the author just explicitly confirmed for us that line 3 referred to the movement of the subtle fire. So when we were talking about whose father is the sun, whose mother is the moon, the wind lifts it up in his body, the land is made sweeter, we were talking about the subtle fire all that time. The subtle fire's father is the sun. The subtle fire's father is the moon. Or events are also, you can also say events are from the sun and the moon. Anyway, since he says if the land is made more spacious from the subtle fire, this subtle fire is a main subject of the prose. He says it surpasses all that is thick and dull. So the subtle fire acts as an agent to even stones in the land, right? Being the main hand that causes their movement. Literally, what he's saying here is literally everything in the world, everything in the natural world is moved by the subtle fire. And then he ends this epic line with, then carry out the work wisely and deliberately. So what it sounds to me like he's saying is that generally speaking, use the same plan of administration as that used by nature. Use what Dr. Ben Dykes called the Platonic conception of what the world is like. Since the intended audience are magicians, the author is telling them to carry out their work wisely and deliberately, keeping in mind the natural movement of the subtle fire. So these artisans of wonders are being told, work with the subtle fire in your work, right? Moreover, they're being told, carry out the work wisely and deliberately. This term, wisely and deliberately, I'm going to come back to that a little later. For line 4, the 9th century recension just has the words father of talismans, treasure house of wonders, perfection of powers. So it's even more enigmatic. But the important thing that I want to point out to you is that line 4 says father of talismans. So both recensions agree that Hermes' message in line 4 specifically concerned magic. Okay, line 5. It climbs from, we're doing great. Climbs from the land to the sky, from the sky to the land, it falls away, containing the force and power of the superior and the inferior. We've actually covered a lot of this already. It just reiterates that the subtle fire is cyclical and it's transcendent, right? This subtle fire is the miraculous activity from the one, the interloper, that later becomes locked in cycle and becomes the inferior and the superior. All of it is moving. Thus all obscurity is illuminated by it, whose power transcends all that is subtle and enters entirely into all thick things. So all obscurity is illuminated by it. The Emerald Tablet appears as prose concluding the secrets of nature. Earlier in the Secrets of Nature, there is a legend that describes Apollonius's subterranean journey that leads to him discovering the Emerald Tablet. And that subterranean journey's central theme is obscurity. I can get into that a little bit more later, or I can get into it more now. Basically, Apollonius, there's a statue in the town where he lives. And the statue says something like, it basically says like, look below for wisdom. And he doesn't really understand what that means. And as he grows up, he goes back to the statue again and again, trying to understand what it means. One day he finally comes to a conclusion and he starts to dig. And he's digging under the statue. So he digs and he digs, and he finds an entrance to a cave underneath the statue. But when he finds the entrance to the cave, as he's climbing down, filthy, trying to get into this cave, there is a wind. And the wind is so violent that it stops Apollonius in his tracks. He tries to make a fire because it's also really dark and he can't see anything. And so his fire keeps getting blown out and he's freezing because there's this wind here. And so he just stops and he sort of despairs. And then essentially the legend says that he just falls asleep in place. Well, when he falls asleep, he has a dream. And in this dream, this somewhat elderly man approaches him, maybe like what we would think of today is like in his 50s or his 60s. And he basically says to Apollonius, hey, you almost have it figured out. You're almost there. Don't give up yet. And Apollonius says, I can't see anything. And this wind really sucks. And so the old man says to him, well, instead of just lighting a fire and letting the wind blow it out, use a lantern. But the terminology that the old man uses is interesting. He says something like, because you can get through this due to human ingenuity. Due to human invention, you can get through this. You can get through your trial right now. Your crisis can be passed. So he puts the light into a lantern and he continues on. But before he does so, before he wakes up, he asks the old man who he is. And the old man says something totally fascinating that I love to talk about. There's two terms that he uses. The old man first refers to himself as the master of dreams. And then after he calls himself, and then there's in another recension, in the Latin version, he says that he's the master of dreams. In the Arabic version, he says, I am your completed nature. That's what he says. That's the earliest reference to the higher self that I've ever heard of. So anyway, after he wakes up from the dream, he takes his lamp and then he goes deeper and deeper in, and he eventually finds another statue, and it doesn't really describe the statue itself, but it describes a book. And supposedly the Secrets of Nature is the book that Apollonius discovered in the vault. At the end, with the epilogue, he says, oh, by the way, there was also this enigmatic prose that was there. But so the obscurity is a central part of the story of the secrets of nature and a central part of the story of the Emerald Tablet. So when he says, thus all obscurity is illuminated by it, that is the author tipping his hand. And he's saying, the obscurity that I'm referring to in the secrets of nature, that is the obscurity that is illuminated by the subtle fire. And so he's giving us tools that we can use to go back and understand the secrets of nature. After that, he just says, whose power transcends all that is subtle and enters entirely into all fixed things. This is a reiteration of the subtle fire's transcendent nature. So line 7 says, this operation is like the composition of the greater world and continues to maintain it. The movement of the subtle fire created and continues to create the world. And then last line, he says, this is what Hermes the philosopher calls triple wisdom or triple science, which is a weird thing to say. So he's calling the operation of the subtle fire triple science, right? Why triple? He doesn't say. I speculate that he's referring to the superior, the inferior, and miraculous activity, i.e., he's talking about how the subtle fire is a common element among all three of these. Right? The subtle, the superior, and the inferior, the land and the sky, are two polarized static elements. And the subtle fire moves between these elements and transcends both of these elements. You have a dynamism that moves between two polar opposites. And that is the foundation of the magic that the Emerald Tablet is talking about. So, back to events. What is the nature of events? If we look at the Emerald Tablet, events are an interaction between the celestial and the natural as a manifestation of the action of the subtle fire. So, do you want more wonderful events in your life? If you do, then it could be all about negotiating the request for the event with the subtle fire and with the celestial, that the natural may be changed in the requested way. All right. You've gone through all this stuff. There it goes at all. It's all going by. Oh. Now we're on to part 2, intelligibility. Okay. Little mini break. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Do you need me to stop for a minute?
I'm going to bug you at the end for links to source documents. This is awesome.
Sure. Yeah. I have some of them written down. Some of them I'm going to tell you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So let's move on to.
I did post a quick question in the chat there, brother.
Oh,
I was sort of just curious if you see much for Hugo. Would the subtle fire, would it have connected to the idea of the mind sort of as prima materia as we see in, I think it's the oracles, Chaldean oracles, right? Or it might be the Eshmetzaref.
Yeah.
Is it the Eshmetzaref? No, it's the oracles, I think. Yeah, for Hugo and for these people, would they have had that association? Because I don't want to impose my interpretation upon them.
That's a great question. I'm going to say it was probably enigmatic to Hugo. Just knowing what I know about what he translated. But I mean that question by itself, like how does this relate to the Chaldean oracles? And how much did De Santillán know? Right? Mm-hmm. How much did he put together? Because it's really interesting. He translated very particular works, right? Other translators like John of Seville, they translated other works. How much of a community were these guys operating in? Or were they just, I'm sure that they weren't taking things at random. But how did they choose what they chose? I don't know.
it seems very unlikely most of these people were operating in complete isolation. They probably existed in some forms of communities, as we see even today. You know, you don't have to be in an order to hang out with other magicians, for example.
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks. This is excellent. Continue, please. Yeah. Sure.
I mean, what I'd really like to see is like a study of some of the original translators, and just like kind of a bird's eye view of their translations, and to see what sort of writing was coming out of them. Besides, how much of an occultist was de Santillana, or was his concentration more literary? I know that they were after this stuff for a reason. But beyond that, I don't know much. I'm just a guy that's really interested in Agrippa magic. Okay, so before we get into Agrippa himself, I want to talk a little bit about intelligibility, because this is going to help to tie the Emerald Tablet to Agrippan magic. So we're going to take a little side journey into Plato. Plato has a concept very similar to the Emerald Tablet's dynamic relationship between the subtle fire and the world. Right? So I talked before, I mean, this talk is like replete with dichotomies of like sky and land. But if we can also look at the dichotomy of the static and the dynamic, we can look at the sky land unit and the subtle fire, and how those two relate to each other. This gets into the concept of what is called intelligibility and sense. That concept, as far as I know, somebody who knows more about Greek philosophy can correct me, but as far as I know, its original manifestation comes along the lines of the analogy of the divided line in Plato's Republic. The etymology of intellect it comes from the Latin intellectus, understanding, and the basic idea of intelligibility is that you have the things I can sort of tie in Aristotle here too. The things that are happening around you are temporary. Right, we've already seen that this is all going through a continual transformation, but there are patterns, right? And the patterns that you see in the natural world are they come from in this concept. There are abstract prototypes to these patterns. And that gets into the concept of Platonic Forms. Platonic Forms is like this enormous topic, but basically, I mean, to really, I'm not doing justice to it, but I'm trying to give you enough so that we can start to get to Agrippa. The root pattern of mundane forms grows from an abstract prototype, and this abstract prototype is the quote understanding of the pattern that's followed by the mundane form. In other words, you have, on some level, you have abstract, ever-living forms, right? So Aristotle's concept of the sky also applies to Plato's concept of forms. And these abstract forms are also seen, since they are eternal, they are also seen as true, right? And this, incidentally, this gets you to a core concept of astrology. Right, that you have these patterns of truth that are continually repeated in the natural world, and that these patterns are seated in very specific ways. So when we look at intelligibility and we look at sense, this is just coming to mind now, so I don't really have a reference for you for this, but basically in the Greek conception of the transmigration of souls, the moon acts as a very important intermediary in the birth of people. So basically what happens is that souls like sort of, they gather, and at certain specific times, at the full moon and at the new moon, they are dispersed. They are distributed into, if I'm remembering my Greek well, they are distributed into the atmosphere, and then from there they are slowly birthed over the term. So from new moon to full moon, you get all of the people that are born are their souls are gathered in that new moon, and then at the full moon, those souls that are gathered are again born. But you have this. So you have this concept of intelligibility. Intelligibility being the eternal, abstract, prototypical truth. And then you have the world of sense, which is the world of the temporary, and the world of the temporary, the stuff that's continually changing, and the false. The false only because it's only going to be there for a little while. Okay, so now we're going to have a little recap of the moon. In the Hymn to King, I was thinking about going back, but I won't. So I'm going to read to you again from the Hymn to King Helios. By Athene's aid, Selene beholds the intelligible. So that's like super important thing number one. The moon is the one that can see the intelligible, that can see true things, right? It says that she beholds the intelligible, which is higher than the heavens. So the Aristotelian sky, the moon can transcend that and see through to these prototypical forms. And it says, she beholds the intelligible and adorns with its forms the realm of matter that lies below her. So in the Hymn to King Helios, we have this transition happening through the moon. So the moon can see, the moon actually, in the Hymn to King Helios, like the metaphysics involved is that the moon sees with the light of Athene, right? So what happens, so the Hymn to King Helios is a sort of weird, it's a strange mythology to it, but it makes a lot of sense the more you look at it. Basically, Athene is the goddess of justice and the goddess of, well, the goddess of justice and the goddess of truth. She's born from Helios, right? So instead of Zeus birthing Athene, she is born from Helios. She's born from the light, right? She's born directly from the light. And so, and one of the functions that she has is she acts as light for the moon so that the moon can see the intelligible. And that's how the sun and the moon both co-lead the natural world. So through the Hymn to King Helios, we see the concept of the subtle fire and the concept of intelligibility as somewhat interchangeable, right? Because in the Emerald Tablet, it talks about how the mother to the subtle fire is the moon, right? And it moves through and it moves into the natural world. Well, so as soon as you get to the border of the moon, the movement of the subtle fire and the movement of intelligibility into sense are somewhat interchangeable. So subtle fire and the ultimate abstract will of the intelligible, those become both sort of the same thing, right? Because you have two static elements and then you have a dynamic element outside the static system. That dynamic element is called the subtle fire in the Emerald Tablet. But if we look at Platonic forms, we can see that the intelligible is actually sort of, it's actually, you can actually see it as kind of the same thing as the subtle fire. All right, I've taken you on a little side trip through intelligibility. My point being that your understanding of the subtle fire in the Emerald Tablet and your understanding of generally intelligible things, those can inform one another. Okay, great. We've come on to part 3. Agrippa. Agrippa is most known for his book, Three Books of Occult Philosophy, which is, a lot of people know about that. It's written in 3 books that roughly correspond to 3 worlds. In book 1, chapter 1, the very first thing that Agrippa says is, seeing there is a threefold world: elemental, celestial, and intellectual. The elemental is the natural world. It's the natural world that we've been talking about all this time, from Aristotle to the Emerald Tablet. It's the elemental can be seen as the land part of the Aristotelian understanding. The celestial is the celestial world. Again, see Aristotle, the concept of the sky, right? The intellectual and intelligible both come from the same root word, intellectus, being understanding. The intellectual world of Agrippa is the intelligible world of Plato. The intellectual world is the world of forms. And as I said before, the intelligible and the subtle fire are interchangeable. So the intellectual world of Agrippa is the world of the subtle fire of the Emerald Tablet. Okay. I want to look at the relation between Agrippa and the Emerald Tablet, because once you can start to see this, you can work with Agrippa. You can work with Agrippa not in a new way, but in a newly informed way. Agrippa, he never explicitly mentions the Emerald Tablet. Not that I've seen. I've read the 3 books many times at this point, and he never says anything about the Emerald Tablet. But there are little hints. One of the famous people that wrote about Agrippa after Agrippa, he was a 17th century magician. His name was Eugenius Philelithes. That was his pseudonym. His actual name is believed to be Thomas Vaughan. And he obliquely identifies Agrippa. This is interesting to me. He obliquely identifies Agrippa with either Hermes or Apollonius in a poem. He says, this poem is addressed to Agrippa, and he says, "But in his emerald still he doth appear. They are but grave clothes which he scatters here." That sort of came out of left field, so I'm going to say it again. "But in his emerald still he doth appear. They are but grave clothes which he scatters here." That is, Agrippa's principles themselves shine in the Emerald Tablet. His writing that we have is just the shell of the living principles from the Emerald Tablet. So Philelithes was like drawing the faintest of lines between Agrippa and Hermes. So what did he mean by that? He doesn't say. What I think he means is that, so first off, Emerald Tablet magicians are artisans of wonders. We saw that before. Agrippan magicians are likewise artisans. They make physical talismans. They make dwelling places for spirits. Emerald Tablet magicians, moreover, have perfect discernment. Agrippan magicians also have perfect discernment, specifically of astrological timing. It's, quote, perfect in the sense that it is vigorous and effective. The theory of both is primarily concerned with a sense of operating within a triple world. And then the last similarity that I see is the consecration of Agrippan talismans. The consecration ceremony itself uses a physical metaphor of the movement described in line 5. Okay, so this is important. Physical movement. Here we go. It climbs from the land to the sky. From the sky to the land, it falls away. Gotta move a thing. Containing the force and power of the superior and the inferior. The consecration ceremony, as used by Agrippan magicians, uses this very thing physically. when he gets into this whole thing about that I have stuff written for, which is all about sacrifices. And he talks about the various forms of sacrifices, and he talks about the various ways to sacrifice. But the movement, when you actually work with Agrippan magic, it's crazy simple. You take something that has rapport with the spirit that you're working with, and you burn that thing. When you burn that thing, the smoke from that sacrifice rises from the land to the sky. And it rises with whatever your intent is. It rises with whatever it rises with the magic that you are making, right? It actually, I can show you how to do it later on. It rises through the talisman itself. So as it rises, it's rising through a symbol of what you're seeking to create. So it climbs from the land to the sky in a literal way. Then from the sky to the land, it falls away. It disseminates into the atmosphere, right? The atmosphere, though, is the realm of spirits themselves. So it is received by these spirits themselves. It is received ultimately by the sky. It's received ultimately by the spirits that you see in the vault of heaven above. Once it is received there, it becomes that which it keeps going, and it goes all the way to the intelligible. And in the intelligible, it becomes an event. When it becomes an event, it goes from the sky to the land. It falls away from the sky. Now it is transformed from a prayer into an event. And it falls away, and it contains the force and power of the superior and the inferior. The reason being that the intelligible has birthed the event that you requested. So that's the last similarity of Agrippan magic and the Emerald Tablet. All right, we've come to the conclusion. Okay, the reason why I didn't show all these is because I don't like reading to people. You are perfectly capable of reading yourself. But I'll leave this one up because I think it's my last slide. Oh no, whatever, I'll leave it up. So I propose letting Agrippa be the teacher and we the students. I propose work with Agrippa exactly as he is in the 3 books. Don't add the 4th book. Don't add any 17th century stuff. Just work with Agrippa exactly as he stands. Sometimes I'll illuminate very specific things that Agrippa is referring to by using later magicians. There's stuff like the Zecherboni has heavy Agrippan influences. But for the most part, I believe in just working with Agrippa as he stands. The first problem you run into when working with Agrippa as he stands is that, of course, Agrippa's method is scattered throughout his 3 books. He touches on many different topics, and all of those topics all do tie together, but you have to make the connections. So, as I say in these notes in front of you, much organization and note-taking is necessary to learn Agrippa's lessons. I've been using Agrippa's method. So a little bit of history about me. I took Agrippa's 3 books. I analyzed it, pulled everything apart, put everything back together. I figured out the most holistic method of Agrippa's from beginning to end. And I used that I've been using that for nigh on 3 years now. It is tremendously successful and tremendously effective. It's the most impressive system I've ever seen. It has a straightforward approach to divinity. Especially straightforward for Agrippa's time. If you were, just your average person that was reading Agrippa, most of what he had to say about divinity would resonate with you. The timing is maddeningly complex. but it's also lucid. You know exactly what you're looking for and why. It's just a question of finding it. Once you're ready for actual ceremonies, it is an incredibly simple approach to ceremony. I probably in this lecture already told you 40% of everything you need to know to perform Agrippan magic. And if you do all this stuff, if you just let Agrippa be your teacher and you just learn this stuff, I believe that you'd be very much following the spirit of the Emerald Tablet. You'd be following its counsel closely. So that's the end of my formal presentation. I have more to say about a particular part of the Emerald Tablet. Does anybody have anything that they want to say?
So I really like that piece about kind of the circulation where you burn it and it goes up in the smoke and then it does its thing in the ether and then it comes back down. I'm always kind of working from an alchemical viewpoint, and the model that I always try to refer to there, I believe the common words are pyrolytic distillation. So it's essentially, transmuting the stone from the prima materia into a more noble version of what you're shooting for. And that really maps well onto what you've described there. So I need to do a lot of thinking about what you've told us today, but I really appreciate your material here. There's a lot of new stuff for me in Agrippa. So yeah, really enjoyed your lecture so far. Thanks very much.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. And I think your observation of the, pyrolytic distillation is like a central part of alchemy, right? And your observation that when you distill pyrolytically, you have this exact thing that the Emerald Tablet is describing. But I really want you to hold on to this idea that the stone is, that you're working with a version of the Philosopher's Stone, because that was sort of the next part. It's sort of this is like the informal part of it. I can't really write down this part of it. But that's the next part I wanted to talk about was just very specific advice that's in Desataya's Emerald Tablet.
Yes, please.
Sure. So the phrase that I picked out is, actually I wrote it wrong here. It's actually carry out the work wisely and deliberately. In one sense, if you take this in the context in which it appears in the Emerald Tablet, when you say carry it out wisely and deliberately, you're just saying just follow the same process that I've described for you so far. So follow this natural progression that I've already described for you, right? And what that ultimately boils down to is a species of astrological magic. You're taking the Emerald Tablet at its word that the sun is the father of administration and the moon the birther of events. And so carry it out wisely and deliberately could just mean that, just mean that. I think that suspect that there's something more to it. The words that are used for wisely and deliberately are prudenter et sapientiae. So prudenter has a connotation of prudently, carefully, right? And then sapientiae is wisely. Wisdom in this sense has a very specific and important role to play in the overall approach here. When you do things wisely and deliberately, we were talking about dichotomies before. We were talking about sky and land. We were talking about static and dynamic. We were talking about inside a system and outside a system. when we talk about wisely and deliberately, in the natural world, the way that it would have been seen by in Arabic philosophy, in medieval philosophy generally, human beings occupy a unique position in the natural world, because although we are subject to natural forces, we are also able to perceive the intelligible. So we have this gift through the moon that we are able also to grasp the intelligible. That's something that other parts of the natural world cannot do. They just travel forth. We have a unique gift from nature to be able to do things deliberately in the first place. When it says to carry it out wisely and deliberately, you're doing something that you yourself are acting as an interloper, right? So when it says miraculous activity from the one, you are working with the one because you are acting as an interloper here. The natural world is one of fate, but there is a seed of free will that can be planted. And this seed of free will being planted can turn a jungle into a garden if you carry it out wisely and deliberately. So later on, when you see how Agrippan magic actually works, you're going to see this deliberation in action. You're going to see how this deliberation works. And you're going to see that you are deliberating, and then when you actually start working with it, you'll see that your deliberations are causing events, that events are actually coming along. And when you start to see that, you'll see that this vigorous, pain in the ass deliberation is something uniquely human and is a very unique and special gift. I think that's it. I have some references at the end. I have like the hymn to King Helios. The hymn to King Helios is actually, I just have it from archive.org. If you read the hymn to King Helios, it will greatly inform you. The Republic, book 6, is where I got a lot of the intelligibility stuff. The quote from Ben Dykes was from the works of Saul and Mashallah. The 3 books of occult philosophy have the one quote from Agrippa that I had in this lecture. The Latin version itself, if you ever feel interested in these things, I should, you know what? I'm going to put this in the references. It's from this book. It's in French. It's the Chrysopia. It's part 6. And this is the Latin version of Secretis Naturae. So if you are of middling or advanced skill in Latin, I'd say definitely get this thing because it has it's going to give you so much more context on the Emerald Tablet than you would otherwise have, because it contains the work from which the epilogue is written. The only other one, if you've never read it before, I highly, highly recommend it. It's called Alchemy, the Poetry of Matter. It's by Brian Cotnoir. He's the one who turned me on to the Arabic version of the Emerald Tablet, and me digging into what he had to say is what brought me to the De Santillana version. By the way, Brian is an awesome, awesome dude. He lives in New York City, and he's mind-blowing. So yeah, that's it. I remember there's a request for references. Were there any references that you wanted that I didn't just give?
What was the specific work with the search below for knowledge? What was that from again? Sorry.
Search below for knowledge.
So he was looking underneath the statue. He dug into the ground.
Right. That's from The Secrets of Nature.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that's from there. And then the introduction to The Secrets of Nature in Chrysopia has a French version of that legend. So if you're like me and you're way better in French than you are in Latin, that's worth reading. it also has the introduction has its own translation from the Latin into French. So you can see, you can compare and contrast my version with things.
That was excellent, brother. Thank you very much. And thanks for everyone for attending this free open lecture with our brother Joseph Zabinski at Hermetic Mystery School. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we're going to open this up to a little Q&A discussion and all of that fun. All right.